Jamaican DJs, or talkover artists alternatively known as toasters, had by the early 1970s crossed over onto records in a big way, with 7-inch singles and the first few full-length DJ LPs appearing. Yet their natural environment remained performing live in the dance hall, the open-air dances, performing on a sound system, chatting their lyrics into a microphone, and feeding off the energy of the crowd, responding to what they were saying and how they were saying it. Sometimes the different sound systems would clash against each other, each with their DJ at the microphone. In the parlance of the times, one could flop the other with the right combination of a charismatic and skilled DJ at the mic, the right tunes being played on the stereo, and the right refreshments to be being served, judging by the ebb and flow of the crowd. Whichever one pulled in the most people would be judged the winner. Many of the most inspired and impromptu DJ performances were never captured on tape, but faded away into the humid Jamaican night air, never to be heard again. Not all the DJs could perform in a recording studio as they could on stage in front of a live audience. Some had bad luck, bad breaks, never got promotion, or simply could never develop a convincing enough individual style that would translate well to records. One who did manage to do so, prefiguring a style that would later come to be known as rock stone, a very gruff, deadly serious style of vocalizing, sounding like it's coming from someone who has lived a tough ghetto upbringing and only barely survived to tell the tale, was Linval Carter, aka Prince Jazzbo, who somehow never got quite the acclaim of his contemporaries, yet remained a DJ who managed to persevere against the odds and forge a long and successful career for himself. He was born on September 3rd, 1951 in Clarendon, Jamaica, would spend his childhood shuttling between his mother's home in Clarendon and an aunt's house in Spanish Town outside Kingston. Developed a love of music very early on, also got his nickname quite young. Apparently he had relatives in the UK who would send him shoes which had a manufacturing stamp of GB on the sole for Great Britain. GB, a corruption of which would become his nickname, Jazzbo. Developed a love of music and began singing very early on, with his inspirations being Toots and the Maytals and Alton Ellis. Reportedly was taken to a recording studio at the age of 10, but nothing really came of that. His growing fascination with music and with the many sound systems that proliferated in the area. Even one of his uncles operated a local sound in Spanish Town called Briscoe's Hi-Fi. His love of music would bring him into conflict with his aunt, who he lived with in Spanish Town, a devout Christian woman who saw music, especially performing music, as sinful. She would finally throw young Jazzbo out of her house by the age of 13, leaving him essentially homeless and left to fend for himself on the tough streets of Jamaica. By 14, he had landed at a local sound called Killer Whip, where he began DJing on the microphone and began making a name for himself as a formidable adversary in the many clashes that were happening. One of the rival DJs he would clash with in these early days was another DJ by the name of Iroy. The two men would factor in each other's lives for many years to come. Iroy could sometimes be heard on the renowned Ruddy's Supreme Ruler of sound system. One particularly memorable clash on New Year's Eve of 1970 saw Jazzbo clashing with Iroy, fronting another sound. In the audience that night was Clement Seymour Coxon Dodd, founder of Studio One, who was impressed with Jazzbo's delivery on the microphone and invited him to come to the studio at 13 Brentford Road in Kingston to do some recording. Jazzbo indeed showed up there a few days later. Studio One by this point was well into an imperial phase, recording a seemingly endless parade of classic songs, classic LPs, and building up a rich stockpile of rhythm tracks that would become something of a universal language in Jamaica, in reggae, known by everyone, versioned many, many times over. Cox and Dodd would set the young DJ Prince Jazzbo loose on some of these rhythm tracks. Always difficult to say with certainty what happened when, but some say the very first song that Jazzbo would voice over was the debut single by a group called Burning Spear, a song called Door Peeper, which was included on their debut album, released 1969 in Jamaica. The song Door Peep Shall Not Enter, deeply dread, somewhat uncommercial at the time. A door peep in Jamaican slang, also known as a duppy, is a malevolent spirit that can do harm to the living, a creature from another world that can cause great harm to this world. Jazzbo would voice this over as the very dread Imperial Eye, declaring himself as a brethren of Rastafari and chanting the praises of Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie I, the deity of the Rastafarians.
I, son of the Most High, Jah Rastafari, our heart shall correspond and beat it in one harmony. Sounds from the burning spear.
His imperial majestic eye, a brethren of Rastafari. The serpent king of Ethiopia will sit on the throne of Zion, yet Selassie I.
Shall not enter. These are all along. We walk on a tree, man's coffee, sipping from the cup of tea.
6 weeks after being recorded, Prince Jazzbo's Imperial Eye would be released as a 7-inch single. Jazzbo would remain at Studio One for the next 2 to 3 years, recording his lyrics over some of the top shelf Studio One rhythms of the day, sometimes with echoes of fellow DJs still in his delivery, but gradually forming his own very gruff, very serious style of vocalizing, often in a very fire and brimstone, apocalyptically dread style. He would revisit Burning Spear's catalog again with their Rocking Time appearing as his own pepper rock. The Carlton and the Shoes classic Love Me and Love Me Forever would be voiced over by Jazzbo as Jadred. The instrumental College Rock by Big Willie here on the Studio One Ironside imprint, based off Eddie Floyd's Stax hit I've Never Found a Girl, would be voiced over by Jazzbo as School, extolling the virtues of education, a theme that would crop up often in his songs. One of his biggest hits from his time at Studio One would be when he took a robust and energetic ride over Horace Andy's classic Skylarking here on Bongo Man, another Studio One label, and voiced it over as Crab Walking on on Bongo Man. Yet many of these sides that he had recorded at Studio One in this period were judged by Cox and Dodd as not being good enough to release. They were held in reserve. Had a full-length LP by Prince Jazzbo been issued at this time, it would have made a major impact, have been hailed as an instant classic, an essential entry in the DJ canon. As it was, Cox and Dodd waited until the early 1990s to collect these sides into an LP called Choice of Version. Choice of Version, the title track itself, based on the Heptones' interpretation of an Impressions song called Choice of Color. Prince Jazzbo, again, vocalizing on the topic of race. I love his t-shirt here, the irony. Someone went to Jamaica and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. classic DJ set. Unfortunately, in one of the setbacks to Jazzbo's career, did not appear at the time it was recorded on, and thus did not quite get the acclaim it deserved. Studio One, classic. Choice of version over the course of the tracks on here, with versions of the Wailing Souls, Fire Coal Man, and many others. The Ethiopians, I'm going to take over now as Take Over Dub. You hear Prince Jazzbo developing that very serious, not to be messed with, rock stone style of delivery, it would later be called.
Yeah, bongo.
Aight. So the man they are forward from here.
Cool, yeah.
So the man can't fool I then.
See.
Aight. The man they have a pretty engine, I tell you.
Aight.
You know? Back to school to learn the golden rule, to get myself real cool. You know? You can't do young, you can't do old, you can't do big, you can't do small. But this is what I've got to tell one and all. To go to school, to learn the golden rule. Calling all dancers, let's put on our dancing shoes, boogaloo and the barbecue real cool. It's good for you, live it up. Sounds to keep you jumping, sounds to keep you coming down with swing. Baby, sing a lullaby you will ring. Now make you come down and do your own thing and swing. While love is love, the war is ugly. Some could never miss exclusively from a race. Some to let you jump and this is how we tell you. Baby, it could never miss. Sounds to keep you moving, sounds to keep you rocking, sounds to keep you running down like Mr. Brown. I went to pick up all down and send them in the pound.
In the early 70s, Jazzbo would depart from Studio One and soon link up with independent music producer Glenn Brown. For Brown, Jazzbo would first voice over one of Glenn's prime rhythm tracks, known as Dirty Harry, as Mr. Harry Skank, incorporating elements of the traditional Jamaican folk song Emmanuel Road. Jazzbo's rough and rugged delivery uniquely suited to those lyrics, and he would reportedly record that for half the usual going rate in exchange for obtaining an instrumental rhythm track from Glenn Brown that Jazzbo could then use for his own self-productions, which he had an eye towards starting. Further sides for Glenn Brown would include Mr. Want All, an attack on the rich and greedy, and The Meaning of One, a tale of romantic woes, bringing in a bit of the lyrics from Amos Milburn's One Scotch, One Bourbon, One Beer, seen here on Glenn Brown's Pantomime label, 7-inch single with obscure singer Suzanne Prescott on one side, and the Jazzbo song The Meaning of One on the other Pantomime label. The Jazzbo DJ sides can be found on the essential Double Attack compilation of Pantomime DJ sides put out by Greensleeves Records. Glenn Brown Productions with Jazzbo.
Going down to Manuel Road, I will drop my heavy load. I will give you just my code. So maybe you could never try to go cold to lost your soul, people. Lego, beg your Lego that I hold this exclusively. From a flick of my wrists, I will tell you it's a hit when I brought the stick to pick up the edge. I Mr. Harry, make you bounce. I Mr. Harry, make you rock so. I Mr. Harry, make you bounce so. I Mr. Harry, make this gangster.
The instrumental rhythm track Jazzbo had obtained from Glenn Brown, called Glenn at the Crossroads, would serve him in good stead as he entered into a period of self-productions, establishing his own record labels, beginning with Count 123 and continuing on to the Mr. Funny and Briscoe record labels, the latter named no doubt in reference to his uncle's sound system, Briscoe Hi-Fi. This period of self-production by Jazzbo, meanwhile, covered on the Pressure Sounds compilation Mr. Funny, the song no doubt giving rise to the record label name, but perhaps ironic in nature given the very serious on-record persona of Jazzbo himself. Pressure Sounds label. One of Jazzbo's initial releases on the Count 123 label, riding that Glenn at the Crossroads rhythm track, would be a solid success for him, selling hundreds of copies, yet court controversy for its lyrics, which some took as taking a very reactionary stance towards women. The song Cranky Bine would be heard by fellow DJ Big Youth, who took exception to its message and issued his own answer record as African Daughters, not name-checking Prince Jazzbo directly, but answering Jazzbo's lyrics back in a song that sought to uplift and promote the African woman. Jazzbo, for his part, would continue on using that same Glenn at the Crossroads rhythm track. He would spin them off into multiple different songs to get his money's worth. He would put out the unrepentant Let Go Donkey on the same theme before again using that same rhythm track, switching to the topic of religion for Stealing, attacking organized religion. A further side by Jazzbo in the early 1970s on his Briscoe label, Wise Shepherd, would cause even more tension reportedly with Big Youth. The lyrics, which Big Youth reportedly interpreted as being his from a song he had composed yet not gotten around to releasing yet. Jazzbo's toast on Wise Shepherd cuts off abruptly at the end before the rhythm kicks in again on the B-side, and Jazzbo continues on, this time taking kind of a third-person tone, referencing himself on Prince Jazzbo Rocking, and taking a more uplifting topic, the one he returned to often, that of education, as he had done on the Studio One side, School. This subject crops up again on a further self-production on his Count 123 label, 4-Star, again promoting the value of education and riding here the Heptones' My Guiding Star rhythm track. Count 123 label, Prince Jazzbo's own. Further self-produced sides by Jazzbo in this period would tackle topics of dread righteousness, as on the very blunt, aggressive Kick Boy Face, Make Them Know Them Place, interpreting the heroes of the Bible as dreadlocked Rasta men of their time. Step Forward Youth and its B-side, Black is Power, taking a very righteous stance on the topic of black self-determination. Jazzbo's Mercy, aka Youth in Service, would ride the Have Some Mercy rhythm track, originally recorded by Lee Perry. The song Kick Boy Face, meanwhile, would serve as the title track of an LP by Prince Jazzbo, which would be produced by Uber producer Bunny Lee.
But now is the time that black people should look into themselves and see that their back is against the wall. That is what the man Marcus Garvey prophesied, you know. Step forward, youth, and let her tell you the truth. Step forward, youth, for the Babylon abroad. So you keep by fears, make them know them place. Keep by fears, till you make them know them place. Long time ago, I used to read about the strong man of old and called Samson. He was a dreadlocks man. And then I read about little David. He was a dreadlocks man.
And who say Jah no dread them a jester? Who say Jah no dread them a jester? Say who say Jah no dread? Say who say Jah no dread? Say who say Jah no dread them a jester? So you keep white face, make them tell you. Keep white face, make them know them place.
With the release of the Kick Boy Face LP in 1975 on the Third World label in the UK, Jazzbo at last had a full-length album to his credit on the marketplace. Remember, that full album's worth of sides he had recorded earlier at Studio One, not released as such until almost 20 years after they were recorded. The Kick Boy Face LP, not in my collection, was produced by Bunny Lee, but includes overlap with Prince Jazzbo self-productions that had come out on his own labels and are included on that Mr. Funny compilation, including Kick Boy Face itself and Step Forward Youth, which registered well on the UK market. The connection with Bunny Lee would lead directly into one of the most notorious incidents of Jazzbo's career. I did a whole video on this a few years back, so maybe I won't go into quite as much detail here. I'll put a link somewhere. One day, circa 1975, Jazzbo had been in the studio on the microphone trying to voice a rhythm track. Bunny Lee was the producer. It wasn't quite coming together. He couldn't get a feel for the track. So in his place, Bunny Lee put in fellow DJ Iroy. Remember, Iroy and Jazzbo had known each other for years, had clashed against each other, going back to Jazzbo's very early days as a teenager on the Killer Whip sound system in Spanish Town. Iroy did what was called a rundown vocal, just a spontaneous, off the top of his head toast in which he insulted Jazzbo, said, "Jazzbo, if you were a jukebox, I wouldn't put a dime in your slot." Everybody thought it was a joke, thought it would go no further than that, but Bunny Lee, perhaps seeing dollar signs floating in front of his eyes, released it as a single called Straight to Jazzbo's Head. Later taking Jazzbo aside and saying, "Look, Ira put out this song. He's calling you out. He's dissing you. You need to respond." Jazzbo, for his part, wasn't too enthusiastic about the whole thing, but felt he had no choice other than to respond and issued a song called Straight to Iroy's Head, in which he said, "Iroy, you a boy. You imitate the great you Roy. Why you come trouble Prince Jazzbo? Prince Jazzbo never trouble you." And the feud was on, with them lobbing 45s back and forth to each other with increasingly escalating insults, casting aspersions on each other's masculinity. Many feel Jazzbo kind of got the worst of the feud, as Iroy seemed to take to it with relish, gleefully coming up with more elaborate insults with each record. The feud with Big Youth and his circle would also reach a boiling point during this time while these records were coming out. One day, Jazzbo was walking down the street on North Parade and was spotted by a friend and associate of Big Youth, Trevor Lego Beast Douglas, who chucked a glass bottle at Jazzbo and hit him in the head. Jazzbo had to bolt and duck under a truck to escape further physical retribution. When Iroy heard about this, of course, that provided grist for his next musical salvo, in which he said, "This incident happened on North Parade. Him run past Kincaid, he couldn't get no first aid." Jazzbo eventually bowed out of the musical feud, but his place was taken by Derek Morgan, carried on for a little bit further, and is still fondly remembered by fans of the music to this day.
If you are my girl, you're gonna wheel and roll until it do the whole wide roll. See you coming down, my baby, little come my sister call me, yeah. Jazzbo, do you hate I? Or do you wanna fly way down to the sky? But when it's you with you, boy, you're gonna tell me goodbye. And never you look so shy, yeah. Come on, we down there now. Jazzbo, man, if you was a jukebox, and I wouldn't put a dime into your sound until you see we round there.
Yeah, Jazzbo.
Yeah, so what the man hear the tune with the boy Ira call up the idea. Well, right now, I see some man try to live off a man name, you know, dreadlocks. You know. Ira, you a boy. Move out the way. You imitate the great you, Roy. Ira, you a boy. Come on. Cause you imitate the great you, Roy. Come, trouble Prince Jazzbo. Prince Jazzbo never trouble you. You come, trouble Prince Jazzbo. Prince Jazzbo never trouble you.
In 1976, Jazzbo would begin recording in earnest with the great producer Lee Scratch Perry. The two had known each other for a while, had worked together going back to 1974 when Perry had just recently opened his Black Ark studio and was being visited by English journalist Chris Lane, who had arranged to interview Jazzbo at the studio. Accordingly, when Jazzbo came by, him and Perry got together, started doing the odd recording, beginning with an updating of the old Mento standard penny reel. But by 1976, Perry had upgraded the sound of his studio and secured an international deal with Island Records, and was keen to get to work, was embarking on a series of recordings that would mark the apex of his famed Black Ark sound, dripping with steaming jungle atmosphere. Perry had already put out a DJ album by Ja Lion, aka Ja Lloyd, Columbia Collie, which used primarily older rhythm tracks. For Jazzbo, Perry presented him with some newly created ones. They were all completed. All Jazzbo had to do was come in and voice over them. The whole process took reportedly less than an hour and resulted in yet another classic album for Perry, one of a string he was releasing at this time. Natty Passing Through by Prince Jazzbo was released in the UK, not on Island Records, but on the smaller Black Wax label. This is a more recent Studio 16 reissue, iconic cover portrait. The title track, Natty Passing Through, telling a somewhat metaphysical tale of a dread passing through the underworld, taking aim once again at the Catholic Church, one of the favorite targets of Prince Jazzbo's ire. Prophet Liv would ride a thunderous Perry recut of the Sata Masagana rhythm and feature Augustus Pablo on melodica, while Ital Corner would ride the iconic rhythm also used for Max Romeo's One Step Forward. Jazzbo vocals would recur on Perry's Super Ape album, with the Dread Lion revisiting the rhythm track of Dreadlock's Corner, and a partial Jazzbo toast appearing on Croaking Lizard. However, in yet another of those setbacks for Jazzbo in the LP arena, the album achieved underground success, became known as a classic, but never got the distribution it deserved. It would be not until 1979 when it would be issued in the US under the different title and with a slightly altered track list and new cover art as Ital Corner. Very similar album, slightly different track list on the Clock Tower label based out of New York. Also iconic cover art, but more or less the same LP.
One step forward, two step backward. One step forward, one step backward. I tell truly, I tell truly, I tell truly, I tell truly, I tell round the corner, I tell round it, I tell round the corner, I tell round it.
Jazzbo would continue performing live on sound systems and recording right up until his death in 2013 from lung cancer. Yet it seemed that the album market, with the path toward lasting acclaim and longevity that it offered, was not to be his. 1977's Ja Guide for the Morwells on their Morwell Esquire label would find him as righteous as ever, while 1980's 12 Tribes Posse on the Joe Gibbs label, a Quaker sound system copy there, would find him DJing over Dennis Brown's Let Me Love You, and while sticking to the very righteous dread Rastafari themes that he was accustomed to, find him adapting well to the changing sound of Jamaican music as the early dance hall era dawned. 1982's A DJ Explosion from US-based label Heartbeat Records, very early release from them, Heartbeat Records 04, would be one of the earliest live sound system recordings and feature Jazzbo on there. Prince Jazzbo with Out of Hand Babylon, sticking to uplifting themes of consciousness even as the dance hall era was in full swing, one of the early releases to record the DJs in their natural element of performing live on sound systems. By the early 1970s, Jazzbo had set up a new label, Ujamaa, which would carry his productions from thence forward, began to focus less on himself as an artist, his releases becoming more sporadic, and focus more on producing other artists, particularly his good friend, the blind singer Frankie Paul, sometimes called the Stevie Wonder of Jamaica. And Jazzbo also adapted well to the emerging digital technology of Jamaica in the 1980s. As reggae became more computerized, Jazzbo began working with a singer called Horace Ferguson, seen here on Leave Babylon on the Ujamaa label with its logo of two people riding a donkey. Horace Ferguson's Sensi Addict would be a major early digital hit produced by Jazzbo. Jazzbo would, as a producer, would never kind of be in the first division, but would carve out a respectable career for himself with a series of well-regarded productions through the 1980s and beyond. Even producing his old rival, Iroy, whom he had feuded with several years before. Jazzbo, perhaps never having got quite the acclaim he deserved for all his dread seriousness, the irony of the song title and record label, Mr. Funny. It may be said that Jazzbo in the end had the last laugh as he carved out a quite respectable career for himself without quite getting across with that one iconic hit or classic album release. This concluded my look at Prince Jazzbo. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.